I grew up in a house where love was conditional, and the conditions were never written down. You just had to figure them out on your own, usually by watching how differently the rules applied depending on who was asking. My mother was a kind woman in the way that some kind women are generous to a fault with everyone except the people who needed it most. She made cookies for neighbors she barely knew. She donated to every fundraiser that came through the mail. She remembered the birthdays of distant cousins and old church friends, and the woman who cut her hair twice a year, but she never once asked me how I was doing without following it up with a comment about my brother. My brother was the one she talked about first at every dinner, every phone call, every holiday gathering where extended family crowded around tables and asked the usual questions. He was 3 years older than me, loud in the way that passed for charisma at parties, and he had a talent for making people feel like they were the most interesting person in the room right until the moment he needed something from them. My name is Claire. I turned 31 last March. I work as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in Chicago, which sounds impressive until you explain what it actually means and watch people's eyes glaze over. It means I find the money people hide. I trace the paths that money takes when someone doesn't want it to be followed. I read spreadsheets the way other people read faces, looking for the tells, the inconsistencies, the numbers that don't quite add up. My mother called it working with computers. My brother called it being a human calculator. My aunt once asked if I was some kind of tax person. I stopped correcting them years ago. Growing up, I was the quiet one. Focused, my teacher said. Reserved, my relatives said. My mother said I was in my own world, which was her way of saying she didn't quite understand me and had decided to make peace with that. My brother, on the other hand, was never in his own world. He was always loudly, exhaustingly present in everyone else's. He dropped out of college after 2 semesters, moved back home, and spent the better part of his 20s cycling through business ideas that never quite materialized. There was the food truck, the landscaping company, the online resale venture. Each one started with a burst of enthusiasm and ended the same way, with him asking our mother for a short-term loan that was never repaid, and our mother pretending it hadn't happened. By the time I graduated with my certification and landed my first real position, my brother had settled into a comfortable pattern. He lived 20 minutes from our mother, showed up for Sunday dinners, fixed things around her house when the mood struck him, and positioned himself as the devoted son, the one who stayed close, the one who was there. I lived in Chicago. I called twice a week. I visited for every major holiday and flew in on short notice when my mother had her knee surgery 2 years ago. None of that seemed to register the same way that proximity did. He was the one she bragged about. Even when there was nothing to brag about, she found something. Last Thanksgiving, she told the whole table about how he'd helped a neighbor move furniture. Everyone clapped. My father, my stepfather, technically, though he'd been around since I was 9, nodded like my brother had just returned from war. Then my mother turned to me and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I was still doing that accounting thing. Still doing that accounting thing. I smiled and said yes. I didn't mention that I'd just wrapped up a case involving 7 figures in misappropriated estate funds. I didn't mention that I'd been cited by name in a federal court filing 3 weeks earlier. I just said yes, and helped myself to more mashed potatoes, and watched my brother accept another round of compliments for existing near the family home. That was the rhythm. I was background music. He was the main event. I want to be clear that I didn't hate my brother. Hate requires a kind of energy I'd long since stopped spending on him. What I felt was something closer to resignation, the tired recognition that some people are built to coast, and the people who love them will always find a way to make room for that coasting. What I didn't account for was what he was doing when no one was watching. It started with small things. My mother mentioned, offhandedly during one of our phone calls, that she'd had trouble with her bank account. Some confusion about a transfer. She brushed it off before I could ask more. A few weeks later, she said something about a check she didn't remember writing. Again, she changed the subject. I am trained, professionally, to notice when something doesn't add up. But I also know the difference between pattern recognition and paranoia. So I filed it away and kept watching. Then my mother got sick. It wasn't sudden. She'd had high blood pressure for years, and the doctors had been warning about stress and diet for longer than any of us had been paying proper attention. But the stroke in January was sudden, the kind of event that turns a normal Tuesday afternoon into something you'll spend years trying to straighten out inside your own head. I drove to Ohio the same night I got the call. I walked into the hospital at 2 a.m. to find my brother already there, sitting with my stepfather in the waiting room, both of them looking exactly like men who'd been sitting in uncomfortable chairs for several hours. He stood when he saw me. "She's stable," he said. "You didn't have to come all this way." "She's my mother," I said. "Where else would I be?" He made a face. Not obvious. Just a small tightening around the mouth, a flicker of something that looked almost like annoyance before he rearranged it into concern. I filed that away too. My mother spent 11 days in the hospital. She was conscious for most of them, though tired in a way that scared me more than the unconscious version would have. The doctors used words like significant and monitoring and "we'll know more in time." My stepfather hovered. My brother came and went. I stayed. I slept in the family home, in my old bedroom with the curtain that never quite closed all the way. I ate cereal standing at the kitchen counter because the alternative was sitting at the table where all of us had said things to each other over the years that none of us had ever fully addressed. I drove to the hospital in the mornings and stayed until visiting hours ended. On the 5th day, I noticed the folder. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, partly under a pile of mail, the corner of a legal-sized envelope poking out. I wouldn't have thought anything of it, except for the name printed in the top left corner, the name of an estate attorney whose office was 2 towns over. I didn't open it. Not then. I pushed it back under the mail and stood very still for a moment, listening to the refrigerator hum. That night, after my stepfather had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and pulled up the publicly available records for the estate attorney's office. Standard practice. When something feels off, you start with what's available before you go looking for what isn't. What I found was enough to keep me awake until 4 in the morning. The attorney had filed paperwork on behalf of my mother 6 weeks earlier while she was still healthy, as far as anyone knew. A power of attorney amendment. Changes to beneficiary designations on 2 financial accounts. A modification to the existing will. All of it had been arranged through my brother. I closed my laptop. I went to bed. I lay on my back in the dark and thought very carefully about what I was going to do next, the way I always do when the numbers stop adding up and I need to figure out where the error is buried. The next morning, I called my firm's legal consultant from the parking lot of the hospital. I kept my voice even. I asked the right questions. I listened to the answers. When I went inside to see my mother, I held her hand and talked about nothing in particular: the weather in Chicago, a podcast I'd been listening to, a restaurant I wanted to take her to when she was feeling better. She squeezed my hand twice before she fell asleep. In the hallway afterward, I found my brother leaning against the wall, scrolling his phone. I sat down in the chair next to him and said, quietly, that I'd seen the paperwork on the counter. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his expression was careful, measured. The face of someone who'd been expecting this conversation but was hoping it wouldn't come yet. "She wanted to get her affairs in order," he said. "She asked me to help." "Before the stroke?" I asked. He shrugged. "She'd been worried about things for a while. You know how she gets." I thought about the confusion with the bank account, the check she didn't remember writing. I kept my voice neutral. "Did she meet with the attorney in person?" "Of course she did," he said. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything," I said. "I'm asking a question." He put his phone away and looked at me with an expression I recognized from childhood. The slightly wounded look he deployed whenever someone suggested he was capable of something less than good intentions. "I've been here," he said. "Every week, every appointment, every grocery run. You call twice a week from Chicago and you think that makes you the expert on what she wants?" I didn't respond to that. I looked at the floor, then back at him. "I'm going to need to see the documents," I said. "Talk to her when she's better," he said. "It's her business, not yours." He stood up and walked back down the hallway, and I sat there for another minute listening to the sound of the hospital around me. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. A nurse laughed at something a colleague said. Normal sounds, a normal afternoon, except that somewhere in my mother's legal files, her wishes had been rearranged by someone who stood to benefit from the rearrangement. I flew back to Chicago 2 days later, once my mother was transferred to a rehabilitation facility, and my stepfather had settled into a routine. I told him I needed to handle some things at work and would be back the following weekend. He nodded, distracted, the way he'd been since the stroke. In my apartment that night, I opened my laptop and started building the file. This is what I do. This is what I have always been able to do without panic, without drama, without the kind of emotional spiral that makes people act before they think. I follow the trail. I document everything. I keep my personal feelings in a separate column and focus on the numbers. The first layer was the public records, the estate filings, the attorney's documentation, the timeline of changes relative to my mother's health history. The second layer was harder. It required a formal request, through proper channels, for access to accounts, where I had legal standing as a named party. My mother had added me to one savings account years ago. For emergencies, that gave me enough. What I found over the following 2 weeks was not a shock. That's the thing about this kind of discovery, by the time you've confirmed it, you've already known it for a while. The shock comes first, quiet and cold, and then you get to work. $43,000 had moved out of my mother's primary savings account over the previous 14 months. Not all at once, never in amounts that would trigger automatic flags. Small enough to look like normal spending patterns if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention, and I knew what normal spending looked like for a 68-year-old woman living alone in a paid-off house in Ohio, and this was not it. The power of attorney changes would have given my brother full control over the remaining accounts if something had happened to my mother during the stroke recovery. The will modification reduced my share of the estate significantly and increased his. I sat with all of this for 3 days before I did anything. I ran the numbers again. I checked my methodology. I called my legal consultant again and laid out what I had, carefully and completely, the way I would present findings to a client. Then I called an attorney. Not the family kind. A different kind. Her name was Patricia, and she had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had spent 20 years watching people discover that the people they trusted most were capable of things they'd told themselves were impossible. She listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "This is a strong case," she said. "The documentation trail you've built is genuinely unusual. Most clients don't come in with this level of preparation." "I know what to look for," I said. "You're going to need to give your mother the chance to affirm or dispute these changes when she's medically able," she said. "That's the first step." "I know," I said. "And your brother is likely to push back hard." "I know that too." She was right on both counts. I visited my mother on a Saturday in early March, 6 weeks after the stroke. She was stronger by then, moving with a walker, speaking more clearly, frustrated by the pace of her own recovery, the way stubborn people always are. We sat in the small garden outside the rehab facility in the pale afternoon sun, and I told her what I'd found. I kept it factual. I kept my voice even. I showed her the documents on my tablet not to overwhelm her, but because she deserved to see the actual evidence rather than hear a summary shaped by anyone's interpretation. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I didn't sign that version." "I know," I said. She looked at the account records. She shook her head slowly, the way people do when they're processing something they already suspected but kept giving the benefit of the doubt. "I kept thinking I was confused," she said. "He told me I was confused." "You weren't confused," I said. She looked up at me then, and her eyes were clear in a way that I needed them to be. "What do? We let the system do what it's designed for," I said. "You tell me what you actually want your estate to look like." "I have an attorney. We file a petition to contest the amendments, and we let the documentation speak." She nodded once. Slowly, but fully. That was enough. What happened next was not quiet, but I had expected that. My brother called me the same evening. My mother must have told my stepfather, who told him. His voice was the voice of someone who felt betrayed, which I found remarkable given the circumstances. "You went behind my back," he said. "I documented financial irregularities," I said. "That's not the same thing. She's recovering from a stroke, Claire. You think this is the time to stress her out with accusations?" I kept my voice level. The time to have this conversation was before $43,000 left her account. A pause. Then, quieter. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I have the bank records," I said. "I have the wire confirmations. I have the timeline against the original will and the amended version. I have the signature comparison from a certified document examiner. And I have my mother's statement that the amended will does not reflect her wishes." He hung up. My stepfather called an hour later, and his approach was gentler, which in some ways was harder to navigate. He wasn't defending what my brother had done. I don't think he fully understood what my brother had done yet. He was just asking me to be careful, to be sensitive, to think about the family. I told him I was thinking about my mother. He was quiet for a moment. "So am I," he said. "I know," I said. "I believe you. But she's not confused. She never was." The next 2 months moved in the way that legal processes move slowly when you wanted them to be fast, and with sudden accelerations when you'd settled into waiting. Patricia filed the petition. The estate attorney who had processed the amendments was served a formal inquiry. My brother retained a lawyer whose voice on the phone reminded me of someone trying very hard to sound like they weren't worried. He said the transfers were gifts, that my mother had asked him to manage her finances because she was struggling, that the will changes were her idea, documented with witnesses. We submitted the signature analysis. We submitted the account records. We submitted the medical timeline showing my mother's documented cognitive clarity at the time the original will was drafted versus the circumstances under which the amendments were executed. We submitted my mother's sworn statement. I flew to Ohio for the hearing on a Wednesday. Patricia met me outside the courthouse, a small, gray building that looked more like an insurance office than a place where anything of consequence happened. She looked the same as she always did. Unhurried, precise. "Your brother's attorney will try to frame this as a family conflict," she said as we walked in. "A sister who's been absent, inserting herself now for unclear reasons. Don't react to it." "I don't react," I said. She glanced at me. "I know. That's your best asset in there." The courtroom was smaller than the ones on television. The judge was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the expression of someone who had heard every version of every family story and was interested only in the version supported by paper. My brother sat across the aisle with his attorney. He was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize, which meant he'd bought something for the occasion. He didn't look at me when I sat down. My stepfather was in the gallery, hands folded, face carefully neutral. His attorney went first. He was smooth and well-practiced and clearly accustomed to making reasonable-sounding arguments. He talked about devotion, about sacrifice, about a daughter who had built a career in another city and now wanted to parachute into family affairs and rewrite a story she hadn't been present for. He said my mother was of sound mind when she made her decisions. He said the transfers were consensual. He said the will changes reflected her genuine wishes, made freely. He sat down looking satisfied. Patricia stood up and did not raise her voice once. She laid out the financial documentation in sequence account statements, wire records, dates. She presented the signature analysis from the certified examiner who had found material inconsistencies between the signature on the amended will and my mother's verified signature samples from the same period. She submitted the statement from my mother's physician establishing her baseline cognitive function and the specific conditions under which the amendments had been executed. Then she submitted my mother's sworn affidavit. The judge read it in full. The courtroom was very quiet. Patricia spoke again. "The petitioner is not here to relitigate family dynamics," she said. "She is here because her mother's documented wishes were altered without her knowledge, using access that was granted in good faith and abused systematically. The financial record is not ambiguous. The signature analysis is not ambiguous. And the statement from the person whose estate this actually is," she indicated the document before the judge, "is not ambiguous." She sat down. His attorney tried once more. Something about intent and context and the difficulty of interpreting financial patterns in isolation. The judge held up one hand without looking at him, and he stopped. She studied the documents for what felt like several minutes. Then she looked up. She addressed my brother directly, which I had not expected. She asked him whether he disputed the signature analysis. His attorney began to answer on his behalf. She stopped him. "I asked him," she said. My brother looked at his lawyer. Then, at the judge. Then, at the table in front of him. He said he believed the process had been handled correctly. The judge said she did not share that belief. She ruled that the amended will was void. She ordered a full forensic audit of my mother's accounts for the preceding 24 months. She referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential financial elder abuse charges. She said this last part in exactly the same tone she'd used for everything else. No drama. No pause for effect. Just information. Delivered with the weight of having jurisdiction. His attorney said something about appeals. The judge acknowledged this was his right and moved on. I sat very still through all of it, the way I had learned to sit still through difficult briefings when the findings were serious and the room needed calm. Patricia touched my arm briefly when it was over. That's as clean as these go, she said. Outside, the sun had come out from behind clouds and was doing something honest with the light on the parking lot. My stepfather caught up with me at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He looked older than he had 2 months ago, which I understood. He put a hand briefly on my shoulder and said, quietly, that he was sorry he hadn't seen it sooner. I told him that was the point. People like my brother are very good at being seen as people like my brother. He nodded and went to his car. We didn't need more words than that. My brother did not speak to me. He stood by his attorney's car for a moment, and I saw him look in my direction once, with an expression I recognized from childhood, not quite anger, not quite shame, but something that lived in the space between them, the look of someone who had counted on a particular version of the world and was now staring at a different one. I didn't feel triumphant. That's the honest answer. I felt the way I always feel at the end of a case, tired and clear, the way you feel after a long drive when you finally reach the right address and can put the car in park. Patricia drove me to the airport. She asked what I was going to do next, and I said work, which made her laugh. You're allowed to feel something, she said. I do feel something, I said. I feel like the documentation was solid. She shook her head, but she was smiling. My mother called me that night from the rehabilitation facility. She sounded tired but present, which was the combination I had learned to interpret as her version of okay. She said thank you in a way that was really something else, something about having spent too long letting other people tell her what she remembered and what she didn't. You always knew what you remembered, I said. She was quiet for a moment. I should have said something sooner, she said. About the money. I kept thinking I was wrong. You weren't wrong, I said. You were just waiting for someone to take you seriously. Another pause. She said, when you come back in April, let's go to that restaurant you mentioned. I said yes. I said I'd make a reservation. After we hung up, I sat for a while in my apartment with the lights off, the city doing its usual thing outside my window. On the table in front of me was the original case file, months of documentation, organized the way I organize everything, cleanly, completely, every page numbered and cross-referenced. I closed the folder. The forensic audit came back 7 weeks later. The final figure was $61,400. The county prosecutor filed charges for financial exploitation of an elderly adult. The amended will was formally set aside, the original reinstated. My brother's attorney negotiated a plea arrangement that included full restitution, a suspended sentence, and a period of supervised probation. When I heard about the plea, I was in a meeting at my firm reviewing an entirely different case. My phone lit up with a text from Patricia, 2 words, done, clean, and I read it once, and put the phone face down and went back to the spreadsheet in front of me. My colleague across the table looked up. Good news? Predictable outcome, I said, which, where I come from, is the same thing. He didn't quite follow that. He didn't need to. My mother moved into a smaller house closer to a friend from church that spring. She sent me photos of the kitchen, the backyard, the way the afternoon light came through the window above the sink. She had a houseplant for the first time in years, and reported on its progress with the seriousness of someone responsible for something fragile. My stepfather visited her on Sundays. They'd been divorced for a long time but kept the kind of peace that outlasts the reasons for falling apart. He helped her set up a new account at a different bank, with me listed as the only secondary contact. My brother and I did not speak. I did not expect us to. There was nothing to repair, because the thing that broke had been broken for much longer than either of us had admitted. I had just been the one to put the exact figure to it. In June, I took a week off and drove down to see my mother. We went to the restaurant I'd promised, a small Italian place she'd read about in a local magazine, and we sat by the window and ordered more food than we needed, and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this, a book she was reading, a trip she'd always wanted to take, the way the town had changed since I was a child. At one point, she looked at me across the table and said, "I used to worry about you being so serious." "I know," I said. She shook her head. "I was wrong about that too." I looked at my water glass. "You weren't wrong," I said. "I am serious." She laughed a real laugh, unexpected and full. She said, "There are worse things to be." I thought about all the Sunday dinners where I had sat quietly and watched someone else take up all the space. All the phone calls where I'd been an afterthought. All the years I had told myself that being overlooked was just the price of not performing for an audience. I thought about the folder on my laptop, the one I'd closed and filed away the night the plea came through. $61,400. Every cent traced, every transfer documented, every discrepancy confirmed and accounted for. The quietest people, I have found, keep the most careful records. I raised my glass. She raised hers. Outside, the evening was doing the slow, unhurried thing that early summer evenings do in small Ohio towns, the light going gold at the edges, the street outside the window empty, except for a couple walking a dog and a kid on a bicycle, and nothing dramatic at all. Sometimes that's the whole story. Not a verdict read in a silent courtroom, though there was that too. Not the moment the numbers finally confirmed what I already knew, though there was that as well. Sometimes it's just dinner, a window, a mother who finally laughs like she means it. That was enough.